There are places in Eastern Europe where the forests grow so dense that sunlight struggles to penetrate the canopy, where the mist clings to the earth, like the breath of something ancient and watchful. In the lands stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the Ural steppes, from the Baltic shores to the Balkan highlands, the old world has never truly died. It lingers in the spaces between the villages, in the cold currents of forgotten rivers, in the shadows beneath the birch and oak. For centuries, the people who inhabited these lands understood what modern civilization has chosen to forget, that the world is not silent, not empty, not dead. It is alive with consciousness, saturated with the supernatural, and governed by forces far older than the gods themselves. This was the world of the ancient Slavs, a world where every grove had its guardian, every river its spirit, every threshold its invisible keeper. They lived not beside nature, but within it, surrounded by beings who demanded respect, offerings, and above all, remembrance. This is the veil between worlds in its Eastern European incarnation, a boundary as thin as morning frost and as treacherous as winter ice. And on the other side of that veil wait the monsters and demons of Slavic folklore, creatures whose names have been whispered in terror for over 1,000 years. The mythology of the Slavic peoples is one of the most complex and least understood belief systems in Europe, a vast tapestry woven from the threads of animism, ancestor worship, and cosmic dualism that stretches back to the migrations of the early Slavic tribes in the 5th and 6th centuries. Unlike the organized pantheons of Greece or Rome, Slavic religion was never codified by a priestly class or recorded in sacred texts during its pagan height. What survived came through fragments, through the hostile chronicles of Christian missionaries who sought to destroy it, through folklore preserved by peasants in remote villages, and through the archaeological remnants of temples and idols unearthed from the earth itself. The Slavs believed that the universe was inhabited by a multitude of spirits, entities that were neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but rather reflections of nature's own indifference, capable of both benevolence and cruelty, depending on how they were approached. These were not distant, celestial beings dwelling in unreachable heavens, but immediate, tangible presences that walked the same forests, bathed in the same rivers, and sat at the edges of the same fields where mortals lived and died. The world tree, the axis mundi that connected the heavenly plane of gods and birds to the earthly plane of humanity and bees, and finally to the chthonic underworld of snakes and shadows, was not a metaphor to the ancient Slavs. It was the very structure of reality itself. Before Christianity arrived with its cross and its promise of a singular, all-powerful God, the Slavic world was governed by what scholars have termed manism, a religion centered on the veneration of ancestors and the spirits of natural forces. The thunderous Perun ruled the heavens with his oak-splitting lightning, while the shadowy Veles presided over the underworld and the wealth of livestock. The feminine principle was embodied in Matsyra Zemlya, the damp Mother Earth, and in Mokosh, the weaver of fate and protector of women's work. But beyond these high gods, beyond the celestial drama of cosmic duality, there existed a vast population of lesser spirits, demons, and monsters who were far more immediate and far more dangerous to the common people. These entities did not dwell in distant mythological realms. They inhabited the bathhouse at the edge of the village, the mill wheel that turned in the darkness, the crossroads where 3 paths met under the moon. They were the Domovoi, who guarded the hearth, the Rusalki, who sang from the river at midnight, the Leshy, who ruled the deep forest with a crown of branches and a beard of moss. They were the Vodyanoy, who drowned the unwary, the Kikimora, who tormented slovenly housewives, and the Baba Yaga, who devoured children in her hut that walked on chicken legs. And when Christianity swept across the Slavic lands between the 8th and 13th centuries, these creatures did not disappear. They adapted, they survived, they merged with Christian demonology to become even more terrifying, and they continued to haunt the imagination of Eastern Europe long after the last pagan temple had been burned and the last stone idol had been thrown into the river. The survival of Slavic demons and spirits is a testament to the resilience of folk belief in the face of institutional religious change. When Prince Vladimir of Kievan Rus ordered the destruction of the pagan pantheon in 988 and commanded his subjects to be baptized in the Dnieper River, he believed he was eradicating the old religion entirely. The great wooden idol of Perun, with its silver head and golden mustache, was torn down from the hills of Kiev and cast into the waters. The temples were demolished, the priests were exiled or executed, and churches were erected in their place. But the conversion was superficial, a veneer of Christianity laid over a bedrock of pagan practice that had existed for centuries. In the countryside, far from the centers of ecclesiastical power, the people continued to worship in the old ways. They brought offerings to the spirits of the forest and the water. They celebrated the festivals of the agricultural cycle that predated Christianity by millennia, and they passed down stories of the demons and monsters who still walked among them. The church condemned these practices as heresy, labeling the old spirits as servants of the devil, but this only reinforced their power in the popular imagination. The Leshy was no longer merely a guardian of the woods. He was now a forest devil, a servant of Satan, who led travelers astray. The Rusalka was not just a water nymph. She was the damned soul of an unbaptized girl, a cautionary tale about the wages of sin. The process that scholars call devory, or double faith, created a uniquely Slavic form of Christianity that was saturated with pagan elements. A religion where peasants would attend church on Sunday morning and leave offerings for the Domovoi on Sunday evening, where Christian saints were identified with ancient gods and the old festivals were given new names but retained their ancient rituals. The landscape itself was integral to Slavic demonology. The ancient Slavs did not see nature as a resource to be exploited or a wilderness to be tamed, but as a living, conscious entity filled with intelligences, both helpful and hostile. The forest was not merely a collection of trees, it was the kingdom of the Leshy, a vast and unknowable realm, where human rules did not apply. Rivers were not simply bodies of water, they were the dwelling places of the Vodyanoy and the Rusalki, spirits who controlled the flow of life and death. Even the household was not a purely human space, but a liminal zone where the Domovoi maintained order and the Kikimora sowed chaos. This animistic worldview, which scholars trace back to Proto-Indo-European religious thought, and which shows remarkable continuity with the beliefs of neighboring Baltic and Finnic peoples, created a spiritual geography where every location had its own resident spirit, and where crossing from one space to another required ritual acknowledgement and protection. A traveler entering the forest would whisper prayers and leave bread for the Leshy. A bride entering her new home would introduce herself to the Domovoi with offerings of milk and grain. A shepherd driving his flock to summer pasture would perform elaborate rituals to negotiate with the forest spirits, sometimes even promising them the life of a cow in exchange for the safety of the herd. These were not quaint folk customs or charming superstitions. They were essential survival strategies in a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was understood to be permeable, fragile, and constantly in flux. To ignore the spirits was to invite disaster. To offend them was to risk madness, illness, or death. This journey into the terrifying world of Slavic demons and monsters will trace the origins, evolution, and cultural significance of these creatures across the vast expanse of Eastern Europe. We will venture into the primordial forests to meet the Leshy, the shape-shifting master of the woods, whose very presence could drive men to insanity. We will descend to the murky depths of lakes and rivers to encounter the Vodyanoy, the ancient water spirit, who claimed the souls of the drowned, and the Rusalki, the vengeful maidens, who danced in the moonlight and lured men to their deaths. We will cross the threshold into the peasant household to witness the invisible war between the Domovoi, the protective ancestor spirit of the Hearth, and the Kikimora, the malevolent swamp hag, who tormented the living. We will stand at the edge of the village to behold Baba Yaga, the most famous witch in Slavic folklore, whose iron-toothed grin and hut on chicken legs have haunted nightmares for centuries. We will examine the vampiric undead, the Upyr and the Strigoi, whose legends predate and influenced the famous Dracula of Romanian lore. And we will confront the great dragons and serpents, the Zmey Gorynych, with his 3 heads and fiery breath, who embodied the chaotic forces that constantly threatened to unmake the ordered world. Each of these creatures emerged from specific historical, cultural, and environmental contexts. Each evolved over centuries, absorbing influences from neighboring cultures and adapting to the changing religious landscape. And each continues to exert influence on Eastern European culture to this day, appearing in literature, film, and modern pagan revivals that seek to reclaim the spiritual heritage of the pre-Christian Slavs. To understand the creatures of Slavic folklore, one must first enter their domain, and no realm is more emblematic of the Slavic supernatural than the forest itself. The forest in Slavic cosmology was not simply a natural space of trees and undergrowth. It was the other world made manifest, the wilderness that existed beyond the boundaries of human civilization, a place where the rules of mortal existence ceased to apply. The Slavic word for forest, les, carried connotations of both mystery and danger, and the entity who ruled over this realm was known as the Leshy, a name that translates roughly as forest lord, or he who belongs to the forest. The Leshy was not merely a spirit inhabiting the woods. He was the woods, the living embodiment of the forest's consciousness, its will made flesh and shadow. Every grove had its Leshy, every expanse of ancient timber, and these beings varied in temperament, as much as forests themselves varied in character. Some Leshys were relatively benign, content to play harmless tricks on travelers who showed proper respect. Others were malevolent forces who delighted in leading people to their doom, driving them in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion or madness, or luring them into bogs and ravines where they would never be found. The Leshy's appearance was as changeable as the forest itself, a reflection of his shape-shifting nature and his fundamental connection to the wild. He could appear as a towering giant whose head touched the treetops, or shrink himself to the size of a blade of grass to move unseen through the undergrowth. He was often described as resembling a peasant, but with eyes that glowed green like phosphorescent fungi, skin the color of bark, and hair and beard made of moss and leaves. His clothing was said to be worn backwards, his boots on the wrong feet, and he cast no shadow, for he was shadow itself, the darkness between the trees, given form and purpose. The origins of the Leshy can be traced to the animistic beliefs of the Proto-Slavs, who understood forests as living entities with their own consciousness and agency. This was not poetic metaphor, but literal belief, grounded in the experience of living in close proximity to vast expanses of old-growth woodland that stretched from the Carpathians to the Urals. These forests were genuinely dangerous places, home to bears and wolves, filled with treacherous terrain, and capable of disorienting even experienced hunters and foragers. The Leshy emerged as an explanation for the uncanny experiences people had in the woods, the sudden sense of being watched, the inexplicable feeling of turning around to find oneself hopelessly lost, despite following a familiar path, the voices that seemed to call from the depths of the timber, mimicking human speech, but leading travelers astray. He was both the personification of these dangers and the intermediary through which humans could attempt to negotiate safe passage. Forest workers, hunters, and shepherds developed elaborate rituals for appeasing the Leshy. Before entering the deep woods, a traveler would turn his clothing inside out, wear his boots on the wrong feet, mimicking the Leshy's own backwards nature to show respect and understanding. Offerings of bread, salt, and tobacco were left at the forest's edge, and prayers were whispered to the Lord of the Woods. To fail in these observances was to invite the Leshy's wrath, and the consequences could be fatal. He would confuse the senses, making familiar landmarks unrecognizable, causing paths to disappear and new ones to appear that led nowhere. He would mimic the voices of loved ones, calling from deeper in the forest, drawing the victim ever farther from safety. And when his sport was done, when the traveler had been reduced to gibbering terror, the Leshy might simply abandon them to die of exposure, or in his cruelest moods, he would drive them completely insane, transforming them into wild creatures who could never again return to human society. The Leshy's relationship with the natural world was complex and revealed much about Slavic ecological understanding. He was the guardian and master of all forest animals, sometimes depicted as herding them like a shepherd with his flock. Bears were said to be his cattle, wolves his dogs, and he would drive them from one part of the forest to another according to his inscrutable will. This belief had practical consequences for hunting culture. Hunters understood that they were not simply taking game from an empty wilderness, but were essentially stealing from the Leshy's herd, and this required negotiation and compensation. Elaborate rituals surrounded the hunt, and the first kill of the season was often dedicated to the forest lord, left at the base of a sacred tree, as payment for the right to hunt in his domain. If a hunter was greedy, if he took more than he needed, or showed disrespect to the forest and its creatures, the Leshy would ensure that his hunts failed, driving all game away and leaving the transgressor to return home empty-handed and shamed. In some regions, hunters would enter into formal pacts with the Leshy, trading years of their lives, or promising the souls of family members in exchange for guaranteed success in the hunt. These contracts were considered binding and unbreakable, enforced by supernatural law that predated human civilization. The Leshy also had seasonal patterns of behavior that mirrored the agricultural and solar calendar. In autumn, as the forests prepared for winter dormancy, the Leshies were said to become violent and unpredictable, fighting among themselves and creating terrible windstorms that uprooted trees and destroyed everything in their path. On the feast day of Erefei, October 17th in the old calendar, the Leshies would disappear entirely, descending into the earth to sleep through the winter months, and during this time the forests were considered safe for travel. They would return in spring, emerging with the first green shoots and the return of migrating birds, and the cycle of danger and appeasement would begin anew. From the forest, we descend to the waterways, to the rivers and lakes and streams that formed the lifeblood of Slavic settlements, and the highways of trade and communication. Water in Slavic belief was deeply ambivalent, simultaneously a source of life and a gateway to death, a boundary between the worlds that could be crossed in both directions. The spirits who dwelt in these aquatic realms were among the most dangerous in the entire pantheon of Slavic demons, and chief among them was the Vodyanoy, the water spirit, whose very name derives from the word Vody, meaning water. The Vodyanoy was the master of rivers, lakes, ponds, and wells, a malevolent entity who claimed ownership of all who drowned in his domain and who demanded constant tribute from those who made their living from the waters. He was typically envisioned as a bloated, amphibious creature, resembling an old man covered in slime and aquatic vegetation, with webbed hands and feet, glowing eyes, and a long beard of green algae. His skin was described as black or dark green, always cold and slippery to the touch, and his breath carried the stench of mud and rotting fish. He resided in the deepest parts of rivers and lakes, in underwater palaces, constructed from drowned ships, and the bones of his victims, decorated with treasures, lost in the waters over centuries. The Vodyanoy was not content to simply haunt the depths. He actively sought to increase his collection of drowned souls, luring people into the water through deception and supernatural compulsion, pulling swimmers under with his powerful grip, or creating whirlpools and currents that dragged boats to destruction. The rituals associated with the Vodyanoy reveal a culture living in intimate and fearful relationship with water. Hormers, whose livelihoods depended on water mills built over streams and rivers, were believed to be in constant negotiation with the water spirit. When a new mill was constructed, it was customary to sacrifice a horse or a black rooster to the Vodyanoy, ensuring that he would not destroy the mill wheel or flood the machinery. Some darker traditions held that the Vodyanoy demanded human sacrifice, and there were whispered stories of millers who would drown a beggar or a drunk on the night the mill opened, pushing them into the mill race as an offering to ensure prosperity. Fishermen likewise had to appease the water spirit, offering him the first catch of the day and pouring vodka or wine into the river before casting their nets. To ignore these customs was to invite disaster, to find nets torn and empty, boats springing inexplicable leaks, or worse, to be pulled under the surface by invisible hands and added to the Vodyanoy's collection of souls. The water spirit was particularly active at midnight, and during storms, when the boundaries between worlds were thinnest, he could shapeshift, appearing as a floating log or a drowned corpse to lure rescuers into the water, or transforming into a great fish or otter to capsize boats. In some traditions, the Vodyanoy kept servants, the souls of the drowned who became his slaves in the underwater realm, forced to serve him for eternity unless their deaths were properly avenged, or their bodies recovered and given Christian burial. This belief created a powerful incentive for communities to retrieve the bodies of drowning victims whenever possible, for to remain in the water was to remain in the Vodyanoy's power, lost forever to the mortal world. But the rivers and lakes held another danger, one perhaps even more seductive and deadly than the Vodyanoy himself. These were the Rusalki, the water maidens, whose legends have captured imaginations for centuries, and whose nature underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any Slavic spirit. As Christianity reshaped the mythology of Eastern Europe, the original Rusalki of pre-Christian Slavic belief were not the tortured, malevolent ghosts of later folklore, but rather fertility spirits associated with moisture, vegetation, and the life-giving properties of water. According to the ethnographer Vladimir Prop, the earliest Rusalki were invoked in spring and summer agricultural rituals, emerging from rivers and lakes to dance in fields and meadows, their presence bringing the dew that nourished crops and ensured abundant harvests. They were celebrated during Rusalka Week, a festival that occurred at the beginning of summer, when young women would gather to sing songs honoring these spirits and leave offerings of flowers and bread at the water's edge. The Rusalki were imagined as beautiful maidens, with long flowing hair, dressed in shifts of white linen, who spent their days in the water and their nights dancing in moonlit circles in forest clearings and fields. To join their dance was considered a blessing, a participation in the sacred cycle of fertility and renewal. But with the Christianization of the Slavic lands, the Rusalki underwent a profound transformation. The Church, seeking to demonize pagan beliefs and practices, reinterpreted these nature spirits as unquiet dead, as the damned souls of women who had died by drowning, particularly those who had committed suicide or who had died unbaptized. This theological recasting fundamentally altered the character of the Rusalki in the popular imagination, transforming them from benevolent fertility spirits into dangerous, vengeful entities consumed by rage and sorrow. The Christianized Rusalka became one of the most tragic figures in Slavic folklore, a cautionary tale about the wages of sin and the dangers of water itself. According to the evolved legend, Rusalki were most commonly the souls of young women who had drowned themselves after being abandoned by lovers, jilted brides who threw themselves into rivers in despair, or pregnant girls who were murdered by their families to hide their shame. Because they died by suicide or without baptism, they were denied entry to heaven and condemned to haunt the waters where they perished, yearning for the life they had lost and seeking revenge on the living, particularly on men. The Rusalka would emerge from her river or lake at night, appearing as a woman of unbearable beauty, with skin pale as moonlight and hair that reached to her feet, still dripping with water and entwined with water lilies and river grass. She would sing with a voice of heartbreaking sweetness, songs that promised love and pleasure, and men who heard her were powerless to resist. They would follow her voice to the water's edge, entranced and helpless, and she would either seduce them and pull them into the depths to drown, entangling their legs with her impossibly long hair so they could not surface, or she would tickle them to death, laughing with manic glee as they died in spasms of agonized laughter. In some regional variants, particularly in northern Russia, the Rusalki were not beautiful but hideous, appearing as naked, decomposing corpses with swollen bellies and tangled, weed-choked hair, their fingers elongated into claws, their laughter a horrible shrieking that drove listeners mad. These northern Rusalki were purely malevolent, attacking anyone who ventured near the water, especially during their week of ascendancy in early summer, when they were said to leave the water entirely and climb into birch and willow trees, from which they would drop onto passers-by below. The protection rituals against Rusalki reveal the depth of peasant anxiety about these creatures and the lengths to which communities would go to safeguard themselves during the dangerous Rusalka week in early summer. During this period, which typically occurred in the week before Pentecost or the week following it, depending on regional tradition, the Rusalki were believed to emerge from their watery homes and take up residence in the forests, particularly in birch and willow trees, where they would swing on branches and sing their haunting songs. Swimming was strictly forbidden during this week, for the waters were considered empty of their mistresses, and thus paradoxically more dangerous, as any swimmer who ventured in might be mistaken for a Rusalka attempting to return, and thus captured by the Vodyanoy. Young women would form processions and travel to the forest, carrying wreaths woven from birch branches and wildflowers, singing ritual songs to appease the water maidens, and begging them not to harm the crops or bring excessive rain or drought. At the conclusion of Rusalka week, the spirits would be ritually banished or symbolically buried in a ceremony that involved creating an effigy, often a crude doll, dressed in white and adorned with flowers, which would be carried to the edge of the village and either drowned in the river, buried in the earth, or torn apart in the fields, scattering her pieces to ensure she could not return. This ritual banishment, which persisted in rural Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine well into the 20th century, until suppressed by Soviet authorities, represented a communal effort to restore order and safety, to push the supernatural back across the veil and reclaim the natural world for human use. The transformation of the Rusalka from benevolent vegetation spirit to malevolent ghost perfectly encapsulates the process by which Christianity reshaped Slavic folklore, taking existing beliefs and reconfiguring them to support moral and theological lessons about the dangers of sin, the importance of baptism, and the fate of unquiet souls who died outside the Church's grace. From the dangerous freedom of water and forest, we turn to the intimate, enclosed space of the home itself, the threshold between the wild world and human civilization. And here we encounter the domestic spirits who governed the fortunes of the household. Chief among these was the Domovoi, whose name derives directly from dom, the Slavic word for house. The Domovoi was understood to be the spirit of the household, sometimes interpreted as the ghost of the family's founding ancestor who had chosen to remain and protect his descendants, sometimes as an independent entity who had adopted the family and claimed the dwelling as his own territory. Unlike the dangerous spirits of forest and water, the Domovoi was generally benevolent, provided he was treated with proper respect and given the offerings he demanded. He was imagined as resembling the patriarch of the household, an old man of small stature covered in soft hair or fur, sometimes with a long grey beard, sometimes appearing almost animal-like with features that suggested a cat or a dog. He was invisible to most people, most of the time, preferring to work unseen, though certain individuals, particularly children and those with second sight, might catch glimpses of him moving through the shadows of the cellar or the space beneath the stove, which were his traditional dwelling places. The Domovoi was intensely territorial and possessive of his house and the family he protected, and his moods directly influenced the prosperity and harmony of the household. When pleased, he would ensure that livestock thrived, that bread rose properly, that milk did not sour, that fires burned evenly in the stove, and that thieves and evil spirits were kept at bay. He would warn the family of impending danger through various signs, moaning in the night if death approached, moving objects if strangers with ill intent drew near, and even appearing to family members in dreams to offer counsel or warning. The relationship between the Domovoi and the household was formalized through a complex system of customs and offerings that varied by region but shared common elements across the Slavic world. When a family moved to a new house, they would ritually invite the Domovoi to come with them, preparing a special place in the new dwelling and bringing fire from the old hearth to the new one, for the Domovoi was believed to reside in the hearth fire itself. On important feast days, particularly on the eve of major holidays, the family would leave offerings for the Domovoi beneath the stove or in the corners of rooms, gifts of bread, salt, porridge, and sometimes vodka or kvass. The master of the house would bow to these corners and whisper invocations, asking for the Domovoi's continued protection and blessing. If the Domovoi was neglected or offended, the consequences could be severe. He might engage in poltergeist-like activity, breaking dishes, spoiling food, causing animals to fall sick and die, tangling the manes of horses, and tormenting the inhabitants with nightmares. He was particularly sensitive to insults directed at him or to changes in household management that he disapproved of, and stories abound of Domovoi who drove families from their homes through relentless harassment when they violated traditions or showed disrespect. There are accounts of the Domovoi strangling people in their sleep when truly enraged, sitting on their chests and choking them, leaving bruises that physicians could not explain. Yet for all his potential for violence, the Domovoi was ultimately a guardian, and his presence in a home was considered essential for prosperity and protection, so much so that a house without a Domovoi was considered cursed and uninhabitable. The Domovoi's female counterpart and nemesis was the Kikimora, a malevolent female spirit whose very name evokes fear in Slavic folklore. Unlike the ancestral protective Domovoi, the Kikimora was fundamentally hostile to human habitation, a demon who entered houses to sow chaos and misery. Her origins, like those of many Slavic spirits, were multiple and regionally variable. In some traditions, she was the ghost of a girl who died unbaptized or who was stillborn and buried improperly in or near the foundations of a house. In others, she was summoned by sorcerers or carpenters who had been cheated of their wages and who hid cursed objects in the walls or beneath the threshold to doom the dwelling. The Kikimora was typically described as small and withered, resembling an old woman, or sometimes a deformed child, with thin limbs, wild hair, and eyes that glowed in darkness. She was said to live behind the stove, in the cellar, or in the attic, emerging at night to torment the household. Her favorite activities included making disturbing noises, breaking dishes, spilling milk, preventing bread from rising, causing children to cry without reason, and most characteristically, spinning and weaving in the darkness. The sound of a spinning wheel turning in an empty room at midnight was considered a sure sign of Kikimora's presence, and any cloth she touched would be ruined, filled with knots and tangles that could never be undone. She was particularly aggressive towards slovenly housewives, tormenting women who left their spinning and weaving unfinished, who failed to clean their homes properly, or who went to bed without completing their daily tasks. In these cases, the Kikimora would finish the work herself, but would do it so poorly and so maliciously that it was worse than leaving it undone, creating more chaos and attracting the anger of husbands and mothers-in-law. The methods for combating the Kikimora reveal the intersection of pagan magic and Christian ritual that characterized Slavic folk practice. Because the Kikimora was often believed to have been placed in the house, deliberately through sorcery, removing her required counter-magic of equivalent power. Peasants would search for hidden objects in the walls and foundations, charms made of bone, hair, or cloth that had been secreted there during construction, and if these were found and destroyed, the Kikimora's power would be broken. Other remedies involved elaborate rituals of house purification, fumigating every room with smoke from sacred herbs, particularly fern gathered on the night of Even Kapala, the midsummer festival, when plants were believed to possess maximum magical potency. Holy water brought from church would be sprinkled in every corner, and priests might be called to perform exorcisms, reciting prayers and sprinkling blessed salt mixed with charcoal from the church censer. In some regions, the traditional remedy was to take a tincture made from fern roots, which had been infused with holy water, and wash all the thresholds and doorframes of the house, while reciting specific incantations that combined Christian prayers with pre-Christian formulas. The Kikimora represented not just a supernatural threat, but a social one, a mechanism for enforcing domestic standards and gender expectations, punishing women who failed to meet community norms of housekeeping and industry. Her existence in folklore served as both explanation for household misfortunes and as a warning that proper behavior and diligence were essential, not just for social standing, but for supernatural safety. The tension between the protective Domovoi and the destructive Kikimora reflects a broader pattern in Slavic domestic spirituality, the understanding that the home was not a purely human space, but a contested ground where beneficial and malevolent forces struggled for dominance. Honzas, benevolent forces, struggled for dominance. Other household spirits populated this liminal zone, each with specific domains and characteristics. The Bannik was the spirit of the bathhouse, a structure that in traditional Slavic culture stood separate from the main dwelling and was considered particularly dangerous and liminal, a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin. The Bannik was temperamental and violent, capable of scalding bathers with superheated steam, causing them to slip and crack their skulls, or even suffocating them if they violated his rules, which included never bathing alone after midnight and always leaving the third session of bathing for his use. The Avinnik presided over the drying barn, where grain was processed, another fire-prone structure that required supernatural protection and where carelessness could result in catastrophic fires that destroyed entire villages. These spirits were honored with offerings and placated with rituals because the structures they inhabited were essential to survival but inherently dangerous. Places where fire and water, two of the most powerful and unpredictable elements, were harnessed for human use. The presence of spirits in these places can be understood as an acknowledgement of genuine danger and an attempt to personalize and thereby negotiate with that danger through ritual relationship rather than mere technical precaution. No exploration of Slavic demons would be complete without confronting the figure who has become, in many ways, the face of Slavic folklore in the broader world, the witch Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is one of the most complex and contradictory figures in Eastern European mythology, a character who defies simple categorization as either villain or helper, demon or deity. Her name itself is problematic and of uncertain etymology, with Baba clearly meaning grandmother or old woman, while Yaga may derive from words relating to anger, fear, or serpents. Though scholars remain divided, she appears throughout the folklore of Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and other Slavic regions, always recognizable by her distinctive attributes and dwelling. Baba Yaga lives deep in the forest, beyond the furthest settlements, in a hut that stands on chicken legs and sometimes has horse hooves affixed to its door. The hut can turn, rotate, and even walk, and it is surrounded by a fence made of bones, often human bones taken from her victims, topped with skulls whose empty eye sockets glow with eerie light in the darkness. She herself is described as an ancient crone with a nose so long it touches the ceiling when she lies down, with iron teeth that can chew through bone, and legs so bony and twisted they resemble chicken bones themselves. She travels, not by foot, but by flying through the air in a mortar, using the pestle as a rudder and sweeping away her tracks with a broom made of silver birch. When she flies, storms gather and trees bend before her passage, and those who see her shadow passing overhead know to hide and pray. Baba Yaga's role in folklore is profoundly ambiguous, and this ambiguity speaks to her ancient origins and her status as a figure who predates the clear moral categories that Christianity would later impose. In some tales, she is purely malevolent, a cannibal witch who captures children and cooks them in her oven, grinding their bones to make her bread. Heroes who encounter her must use cleverness and magic to escape her clutches, often barely surviving the ordeal. In other stories, however, she serves as a helper and guide, a figure who tests heroes and, if they pass her trials, provides them with magical gifts, wise counsel, or the means to complete their quests. The hero Ivan Tsarovich encounters her in numerous tales, and while she threatens him with death and displays her iron teeth, she ultimately aids him in his journey, giving him enchanted objects or telling him how to defeat his enemies. This dual nature suggests that Baba Yaga may originally have been a goddess or powerful spirit associated with initiation, death, and rebirth, a figure who presided over the dangerous transitions between life stages and between worlds. Her hut on chicken legs resembles the funerary structures that ancient Slavic peoples built to house the dead, small houses raised on posts to keep bodies away from scavenging animals, and her role as a liminal figure, dwelling at the edge of the known world, connects her to the threshold between life and death, civilization and wilderness. She is often depicted as having one leg made of bone, suggesting a connection to the dead and the underworld, and her control over the elements, her ability to command the day, night, and sun, indicates a cosmic significance far beyond that of a simple witch or demon. The iron teeth of Baba Yaga are particularly significant in understanding her nature and her evolution through folklore. Iron in Slavic tradition was associated with transformation and protection, a metal that could ward off evil spirits, but was also used in curses and dark magic. Her teeth of iron mark her as something fundamentally other, not bound by the limitations of human flesh, capable of consuming anything, including the bones of the earth itself. When heroes encounter her, She often greets them by sniffing the air and declaring that she smells Russian spirit, a phrase that emphasizes the fundamental alienness of humans in her domain. They are intruders in a realm that belongs to forces older and stranger than humanity. The trials she sets are often impossible tasks that can only be completed through magic or cleverness. Tests designed to separate the worthy from the unworthy, the brave from the cowardly. Those who show proper respect, who address her correctly and bring appropriate gifts, may win her favor. Those who show fear or arrogance are devoured. This pattern of testing and trial connects Baba Yaga to shamanic initiation rituals, to the ordeals that aspirants to spiritual power had to undergo in pre-Christian Slavic society, descending into the realm of death and confronting terrifying forces to emerge transformed and empowered. The folklorist Vladimir Prop argued that many Russian fairy tales preserve the structure of ancient initiation rites, and Baba Yaga's role in these tales as the terrifying guardian of the threshold supports this interpretation. She is the psychopomp, the guide of souls, the keeper of forbidden knowledge, and the devourer of those unworthy to receive it. From the ambiguous figure of Baba Yaga, we turn to creatures whose malevolence is absolute and whose very existence represents the darkest fears of Slavic peasant culture, the undead who rise from their graves to torment and destroy the living. The vampire in popular culture is largely a creation of Western European literature, refined and romanticized by writers like Bram Stoker. But the origins of the vampire legend lie deep in Slavic folklore, in the beliefs surrounding the Upyr, known also as Upyr, Wampyr, or by various regional names across Eastern Europe. The Upyr was fundamentally different from the aristocratic, seductive vampire of later fiction. It was a revenant, a corpse that refused to remain dead, animated by demonic forces, or by the departed soul's inability to find rest. The causes of becoming an Upyr were many and varied by region, but common factors included dying by violence or suicide, being excommunicated from the church, dying unbaptized or unconfessed, being a sorcerer or witch in life, or having a cat or other animal jump over the corpse before burial. People born with certain physical abnormalities, such as a caul over the face or teeth already present at birth, were suspected of being potential Upyr, and in some communities, preventative measures would be taken even before such individuals died. The Upyr, in its grave, was believed to be conscious and active, chewing on its own burial shroud and consuming its own flesh, and this activity had direct consequences for the living world above. As the Upyr devoured itself in the grave, its relatives would sicken and die, drawn down by the vampire's hunger, their life force consumed to feed the undead thing below the earth. The physical descriptions of the Upyr were grotesque and terrifying, bearing little resemblance to the elegant vampires of Gothic fiction. When graves were opened during vampire hunts, which occurred with disturbing frequency in Eastern Europe, well into the 18th century, witnesses reported finding corpses that appeared fresh and bloated, with blood seeping from their mouths and noses, with ruddy complexions and warm flesh, despite having been buried for weeks or months. Modern science explains these phenomena as natural results of decomposition, the buildup of gases that bloat the corpse and force blood from the orifices. But to medieval and early modern peasants, these signs were proof positive of vampirism. The face of the Upyr was said to be flushed and red from feeding on blood, its body swollen and heavy, and when the stake was driven through its heart, it would release a terrible shriek, and blood would gush from the wound, further confirming the creature's evil nature. The Upyr would leave its grave at night, sometimes appearing in the form it had in life, sometimes as a monstrous creature with glowing red eyes and an insatiable hunger for human blood. Unlike the focused, aristocratic vampires of later legend, who selected particular victims, the Upyr was indiscriminate, attacking family members first, but ultimately threatening entire villages. It could spread plague and disease, its very presence corrupting the land and causing crops to fail and livestock to sicken. The sound of the Upyr moving through the night was said to be distinctive, a horrible sucking or smacking noise, and dogs would howl in terror at its approach. The methods for destroying an Upyr reveal a complex intersection of Christian ritual and pagan practice that characterize much of Slavic folk religion. If a vampire was suspected, the community would gather and exhume the grave, and if the signs of vampirism were present, immediate action was required. The most common method was to drive a wooden stake, often made of ash or aspen wood, through the heart of the corpse while it lay in its coffin. This had to be done with a single blow, for if the stake was not properly placed, or if multiple strikes were needed, the Upyr might awaken and attack its destroyers. In some regions, the head was cut off and placed between the legs of the corpse, or the body was turned face down in the grave, so that if it tried to dig out, it would only dig deeper into the earth. In the most severe cases, the corpse would be completely destroyed by burning, reducing it to ash that could be scattered in running water or buried at a crossroads. Holy objects were essential to these rituals. The stake would be blessed by a priest, holy water would be poured into the grave, and prayers would be recited to bind the spirit and prevent it from rising again. Garlic, which featured prominently in later vampire lore, was indeed used in Slavic tradition, stuffed into the mouth of the corpse or placed in the coffin to repel the demon. The vampire panic that swept through Eastern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries was so severe that it attracted the attention of the Habsburg and Russian imperial governments, which sent investigators and issued official proclamations attempting to stop the practice of grave desecration, but the beliefs were too deeply rooted to be easily suppressed by governmental decree. The evolution from the Slavic Upyr to the Romanian Strigoi represents a regional variation on the undead theme, one that would ultimately influence the creation of Count Dracula through Bram Stoker's partial use of Romanian folklore. The Strigoi shared many characteristics with the Upyr, being undead creatures who fed on the blood and life force of the living, but Romanian tradition added distinctive elements. The Strigoi could be living or dead, a crucial distinction that expanded the concept. A living Strigoi, or Strigoi, was essentially a witch or sorcerer who could send their soul out of their body at night to attack others, a form of astral vampirism. These living vampires would fall into death-like trances while their spirits roamed, and if the body was disturbed or turned over while the soul was absent, the person would die because the soul could not find its way back. Dead Strigoi, or Strigoi mort, were corpses animated by demonic forces, and they rose from their graves to drain the blood of family and neighbors. What made the Strigoi particularly terrifying was their intelligence and their ability to appear normal. Unlike the mindless, monstrous Upyr of some traditions, the Strigoi could blend into society, appearing as ordinary people during the day while carrying out their predations at night. They could attend social functions, court women, and engage in seemingly normal activities, all while steadily draining the life from their victims. This concept of the vampire as a sophisticated predator who moved among humans undetected was the element that Stoker would develop and refine in creating Count Dracula, transforming the folkloric undead of peasant belief into the aristocratic monster of Gothic literature. The dragon legends of Slavic mythology present yet another category of supernatural terror, embodying the forces of chaos and destruction that constantly threaten to overwhelm the ordered world of human civilization. The Zmey, as Slavic dragons were called, varied significantly by region and by specific legend, but certain characteristics remained consistent. They were enormous serpentine creatures, often with multiple heads, capable of breathing fire, and associated with both water and mountains, liminal spaces where the wild forces of nature were most concentrated. The most famous of these creatures was Zmey Gorynych, whose name translates roughly as Dragon of the Mountains, or Son of the Mountain, a three-headed dragon that features in numerous Russian folktales and epic poems known as Byeliny. Zmey Gorynych was said to be black or green in color, with scales like iron, wings large enough to blot out the sun, and three heads that could each breathe streams of fire, capable of incinerating entire villages. Each head could think independently, making the creature nearly impossible to outwit. And like the Hydra of Greek mythology, the heads could regenerate unless all three were severed simultaneously. The dragon made its lair in mountains or in caves near rivers, hoarding treasure stolen from the cities and villages it ravaged, and it had an insatiable appetite for human flesh, particularly preferring to devour young maidens of noble birth. The abduction of princesses by Zmey Gorynych was a recurring motif in folklore, and the rescue of these captives was the deed that established the heroism of many bogatyri, the warrior heroes of Russian epic tradition. The battle between the hero and the dragon in Slavic folklore represented far more than simple monster-slaying adventure. It was fundamentally a cosmic struggle between order and chaos, civilization and wilderness, human courage and primordial destruction. The most famous confrontation between hero and dragon involved the bogatyr Dobrynya Nikitich, one of the greatest warriors in the service of Prince Vladimir of Kiev, who was tasked with slaying Zmey Gorynych after the dragon had kidnapped the prince's niece Zabava Putyatishna. The epic tale describes Dobrynya's journey to the Saracen mountains, where the dragon made its lair, his battles with the creature's fire breath that scorched the earth around him, and his ultimate victory, achieved through a combination of martial prowess, magical assistance, and divine favor. But the victory was never final, for in many versions of the tale, the dragon regenerated or returned, embodying the eternal truth that chaos and destruction could never be permanently defeated, but only temporarily subdued, that each generation must face the dragon anew. The Zmey also had other aspects beyond pure malevolence. In some South Slavic traditions, particularly among Serbs and Bulgarians, the Zmey was a more ambiguous figure, sometimes appearing as a heroic protector or even as a supernatural lover who would visit mortal women in the night, fathering children with exceptional strength or magical abilities. This dual nature, this capacity for dragons to be both destroyers and creators, reflects the fundamental ambiguity of the natural forces they represented. The same storm that could destroy crops could also bring needed rain. The same mountains that sheltered dangers also provided refuge and resources. Beyond the most famous creatures of Slavic demonology, there existed a vast population of lesser-known but equally terrifying entities that haunted specific locations, times, and activities. The Poludnitsa, known as Lady Midday, or the Noon Demon, was a female spirit who appeared in the fields during the hottest part of summer days, particularly at noon when the sun was at its zenith. She was described as a tall woman, dressed in flowing white robes, sometimes appearing as a beautiful maiden, sometimes as a withered crone, her form shimmering in the heat haze that rose from the sun-baked earth. The Poludnitsa targeted field workers who violated the traditional midday rest period, those who continued to labor through the dangerous heat of noon, when all sensible people sought shade and respite. She would approach them with questions, endless riddles, about agricultural practices and folklore that the victim had to answer continuously until the hour had passed. If they faltered or failed to respond, she would strike them with disease, particularly sunstroke and heat stroke, or she would dance with them in whirling circles until they collapsed from exhaustion and died in the fields. In some versions, she carried a sickle or scythe, the very tools of harvest turned into weapons, and she would use these to behead those who displeased her, or to cut off the limbs of children who wandered into the fields unsupervised. The Poludnitsa embodied a genuine practical danger, the very real threat of heatstroke and exhaustion that claimed lives in the agricultural societies of Eastern Europe. But she also represented the enforcement of traditional wisdom, the insistence on proper rhythms of work and rest that had been established over centuries of hard experience. The Bannik, as mentioned earlier, was the spirit of the Bathhouse, and his domain reveals much about Slavic attitudes toward liminal spaces and the dangers inherent in transformation. The bathhouse in traditional Slavic culture was not simply a place for washing, but a structure deeply invested with spiritual significance. It was where women gave birth, where marriages were consummated, where the sick came to be healed, and where the dead were washed before burial. It existed at the boundary between life and death, purity and pollution, and it was therefore a place of great power and great danger. The Bannik ruled this realm with capricious authority, and bathers had to observe strict protocols to avoid his wrath. The bathhouse was heated in sessions, and tradition held that the first 3 firings were for human use, while the 4th belonged to the Bannik and whatever guests he chose to invite, which often included other spirits, demons, and sometimes the unquiet dead. To intrude on the Bannik's bathing time was to invite disaster. He might scald the intruder with boiling water, strike them with heated stones, or even strangle them, leaving their corpses to be discovered in the morning, with marks of supernatural violence on their throats. The Bannik was consulted for divination, particularly on matters of future fortune, through a ritual in which the inquirer would stand with their back exposed in the partially open door of the bathhouse. If the Bannik stroked the back gently with his soft, mossy hand, good fortune was assured. If he scratched with his claws, drawing blood, disaster and death lay ahead. This practice of fortune-telling through the Bannik was particularly popular among young women seeking to know the fate of romantic prospects or the outcome of pregnancies. The preservation and transformation of these beliefs through centuries of religious, social, and political change represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural continuity in European history. Christianity arrived in the Slavic lands as an external force, imposed from above by rulers who saw conversion as a path to political legitimacy and alliance with the Byzantine Empire or with Western European powers. But the actual population, particularly the peasantry, who made up the vast majority of Slavic societies, retained their ancient beliefs with remarkable tenacity. The Church's strategy evolved from outright suppression to a more pragmatic approach of syncretism and adaptation. Pagan festivals were given Christian names and reinterpreted through Christian theology, but the underlying rituals and beliefs remained essentially unchanged. The veneration of saints became a vehicle for continuing the worship of ancient gods, with Saint Elijah absorbing the attributes of Perun the Thunderer, and Saint Nicholas taking on characteristics of Veles, the earth god. The demons and spirits of folklore were rebranded as servants of Satan, making them fit into Christian demonology, while actually reinforcing their power in the popular imagination. A Leshy, who had been merely a dangerous forest spirit, became a manifestation of the devil himself, which paradoxically made him more, rather than less real, to believers, who now had both folk tradition and church teaching, confirming his existence. The witch hunts that periodically swept through Eastern Europe, though less intense than those in Western Europe, further embedded these beliefs, as accusations of consorting with demons, riding with Baba Yaga, or making pacts with the Vodyanoy were taken seriously by both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The folklore was preserved and transmitted through oral tradition, through the songs and tales that grandmothers told to children in the long winter nights, through the warnings that parents gave to keep their offspring safe, and through the rituals that communities performed to mark the turning of seasons and the transitions of life. These stories were not entertainment in the modern sense, but essential knowledge, instructions for survival, in a world understood to be populated by invisible intelligences that could help or harm depending on how they were approached. The collecting and recording of Slavic folklore began in earnest in the 19th century, part of the Romantic nationalist movements that swept through Europe and sought to recover and celebrate indigenous cultural traditions. Scholars like Alexander Afanasiev in Russia and Oskar Kolberg in Poland traveled through rural regions, recording the tales, songs, and beliefs of peasants before modernization and education erased them. Their massive collections, published in multiple volumes, preserved thousands of stories and provided the raw material for later academic study. These collections revealed the incredible richness and regional variation of Slavic folklore, with each area having its own particular versions of demons and spirits, its own unique entities found nowhere else. They also showed the continuities, the themes and patterns that appeared across the entire Slavic world, from Slovenia to Siberia, suggesting ancient common origins in the Proto-Slavic period, before the dispersal and differentiation of Slavic peoples. In the modern era, the demons and monsters of Slavic folklore have found new life in literature, film, and gaming, becoming part of global popular culture while retaining their distinctively Eastern European character. The Witcher series of novels and video games, created by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski, drew heavily on Slavic folklore, populating its world with Leshys, Vodyanoys, Rusalki, and other creatures taken directly from traditional sources, while adapting them for modern fantasy narrative. The games in particular introduced millions of players worldwide to monsters and spirits that had previously been known only to specialists in Slavic studies, bringing creatures like the Kikimora and the Noon Wraith into mainstream awareness. Russian cinema has produced numerous films exploring folkloric themes, from the lavish historical fantasy Valve, based on Gogol's story of a young priest confronting a demonic witch, to modern horror films that reimagine traditional spirits for contemporary audiences. The revival of interest in pre-Christian Slavic religion, known as Rodnovery, or Slavic native faith, has created communities across Eastern Europe and in diaspora populations who seek to reconstruct and practice ancient beliefs, honoring the old gods and maintaining relationships with the spirits of nature. While these modern movements are reconstructions rather than unbroken traditions, and while scholars debate their authenticity and their politics, they represent a genuine hunger for spiritual connection to the land and to ancestral heritage that institutional Christianity has failed to satisfy for many contemporary Slavs. The demons and monsters of Slavic folklore are thus not merely relics of a superstitious past, but living elements of cultural identity that continue to shape how Eastern Europeans understand their relationship to nature, to community, and to the invisible forces that move through the world. These creatures emerged from specific historical and environmental contexts, from the experience of living in dense forests and beside dangerous rivers, from agricultural societies dependent on unpredictable weather and vulnerable to crop failures, from communities where winter could mean starvation and where illness often meant death. They provided explanations for the inexplicable, names for nameless fears, and rituals for asserting some degree of control over uncontrollable forces. The Leshy taught respect for the forest and caution in the wilderness. The Vodyanoy and the Rusalka warned of the dangers of water and enforced traditional safety practices. The Domovoi rewarded proper household management and family harmony. The Upyr embodied fears of death and the unquiet grave. Baba Yaga tested the worthy and devoured the unworthy, teaching that wisdom and courage were more valuable than physical strength. And Zmey Gorynych represented the eternal struggle against chaos, the necessity of heroism in every generation. As we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed forests and haunted waters of Slavic folklore, we arrive at the question that lingers at the heart of all mythologies: what becomes of these beliefs when the world that created them has fundamentally changed? The 20th century brought devastation to Eastern Europe on a scale unimaginable to the peasants who once left bread for the Domovoi and whispered prayers to the Leshy. 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes, forced collectivization, industrialization, and the systematic suppression of traditional culture under Soviet communism all conspired to sever the connection between the people and the old ways. Villages that had existed for centuries were emptied or destroyed. Ancient forests were cleared for industry. The bathhouses and water mills, where spirits dwelt, were replaced by modern infrastructure, and the state actively worked to eradicate what it termed harmful superstitions, promoting scientific atheism and mocking folk beliefs as backward remnants of feudalism. Yet the demons and spirits did not die. They retreated, as the gods themselves had once retreated into the hollow hills, but they did not disappear. They survived in the memory of grandmothers, who still whispered the old tales to children, despite official disapproval. They endured in the rural areas, where traditional practices continued in secret, hidden from the eyes of party officials. And when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, and the iron grip of ideological conformity loosened, these ancient beliefs emerged once more into the light, transformed but recognizable, ready to reclaim their place in the cultural landscape of a new era. The revival of Slavic paganism in the post-Soviet period, known as Rodnovery, or the native faith, represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural and spiritual regeneration in modern history. Beginning in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s and into the 21st century, communities across Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and other Slavic nations have sought to reconstruct and practice the pre-Christian religion of their ancestors. These movements are diverse and often controversial, ranging from scholarly attempts at historical reconstruction based on archaeological and ethnographic evidence to more eclectic New Age syncretisms that blend Slavic elements with other spiritual traditions. What unites them is a rejection of Christianity as a foreign imposition and a desire to reconnect with an indigenous spiritual heritage rooted in the land itself and in the spirits who have always inhabited it. Modern Rodnova communities hold seasonal festivals marking the ancient calendar of solstices and harvests. They erect wooden idols of Perun and Mokosh in sacred groves, and they perform rituals honoring the spirits of nature, including offerings to the Leshy, the Vodyanoy, and the household spirits. For these practitioners, the demons and monsters of folklore are not merely mythological curiosities, but living spiritual realities, entities with whom one can and should maintain relationships through proper observance and respect. This is not a quaint hobby or a form of historical reenactment, but a genuine religious movement with tens of thousands of adherents who see their practices as a restoration of balance, a healing of the wound inflicted by centuries of Christian dominance and Soviet materialism. Beyond organized neo-pagan movements, the creatures of Slavic folklore have also found new life in contemporary popular culture, where they continue to evolve and adapt to modern anxieties and storytelling forms. The Witcher franchise, which has become a global phenomenon through both Andrzej Sapkowski's novels and the massively popular video game series developed by CD Projekt Red, is perhaps the most significant vehicle for introducing Slavic folklore to international audiences. The games in particular present meticulously researched versions of traditional creatures, from the Leshy, who can be negotiated with or fought, to the Vodyanoy, who require offerings and respect, to the Kikimora, who infest ruins and attack with supernatural malice. Players worldwide have encountered these entities, learned their names, their habits, and their weaknesses, absorbing Slavic folklore through interactive engagement in a way that no academic text could achieve. Russian and Eastern European cinema has likewise produced numerous films that draw on folkloric traditions, from historical fantasy epics to modern horror films that reimagine traditional spirits for contemporary fears. The 2020 Russian film Baba Yaga, Terror of the Dark Forest, recast the ancient witch as the guardian of a portal between worlds, while various Slavic horror films have explored the Rusalka, the Domovoi, and other creatures through the lens of psychological terror and supernatural thriller genres. The endurance of these beliefs, both in revival movements and in popular culture, speaks to something fundamental about human relationship with the natural world and with the unseen forces that shape existence. The demons and monsters of Slavic folklore emerged from a worldview that understood nature not as a collection of resources to be exploited, but as a living, conscious community of beings with their own agency, intelligence, and moral standing. The forest was not merely timber waiting to be harvested. It was the kingdom of the Leshy, a realm deserving of respect and caution. The river was not simply a water source or a transportation route. It was the dwelling place of the Vodyanoy and the Rusalki, spirits whose goodwill had to be earned through proper offerings and observance. The home itself was not merely a physical shelter, but a sacred space maintained through partnership with the Domovoi, whose invisible labor kept the household functioning and whose displeasure could bring ruin. This animistic understanding, which sees consciousness and intention in every aspect of the natural world, is precisely what modern environmental philosophy has begun to reclaim under different terminology, recognizing that sustainable human existence requires treating the earth not as dead matter, but as a living system with inherent value and rights. The Slavic spirits embodied this ecological wisdom centuries before the term ecology was coined, teaching through story and ritual that humans are not masters of nature, but participants in a larger community that includes forces beyond our comprehension or control. The transformation of these spirits through Christianity, from amoral nature entities to Christian demons and damned souls, reflects the religious and cultural upheaval that reshaped Eastern Europe. Yet even in their demonized forms, they retained their essential characteristics and continue to serve their original functions, providing explanations for misfortune, enforcing social norms, and maintaining the connection between communities and their landscapes. The Rusalka's evolution from fertility spirit to vengeful ghost added layers of moral complexity and tragic depth, while preserving her association with water and her power over life and death. The Leshy remained the master of the forest, whether he was seen as an ancient nature god or as a devil in league with Satan. The fundamental truth persisted: the wilderness is alive, it is watching, and it demands respect. These creatures have survived, not because they are quaint relics of a superstitious past, but because they continue to fulfill deep psychological and cultural needs. They give form to our fears of the dark, the unknown, and the uncontrollable. They provide narratives that help communities process tragedy and loss. They enforce traditions and social norms through the power of supernatural sanction. And perhaps most importantly, they maintain the sense of wonder and mystery that purely materialist worldviews cannot provide. The knowledge that reality is stranger and richer than what can be measured and quantified, that there are still hidden places where magic dwells. The monsters and demons of Slavic folklore are thus not merely entertaining stories or historical curiosities. They are a living inheritance, a connection to ancestral wisdom, and a reminder of truths that modernity has forgotten at its peril. They teach us that the world is not ours alone, that our actions have consequences that ripple through both seen and unseen realms, and that respect, humility, and proper relationship are the foundations of survival. In an age of climate crisis and environmental devastation, when humanity's exploitation of nature has reached catastrophic proportions, the old warnings of the forest spirits and water demons take on new and urgent relevance. The Leshy's punishment of greedy hunters who took more than they needed speaks directly to contemporary concerns about sustainable resource use. The Vodyanoy's drowning of those who failed to show proper respect for water echoes modern warnings about treating rivers and lakes as dumping grounds for industrial waste. The Kikimora's torment of slovenly housekeepers becomes a metaphor for the chaos that results when we fail to maintain proper order and balance in our relationship with the systems that sustain us. These creatures were never merely monsters to frighten children. They were teachers, enforcers of ecological and social wisdom, encoded in narrative form so powerful that it survived centuries of religious persecution and political suppression. And so the veil remains thin in Eastern Europe, in the forests that still stand, in the rivers that still flow, in the old houses where families still gather, and the bathhouses where steam still rises. The spirits endure. They wait in the mist at dawn, in the shadows at dusk, in the silence that falls between one breath and the next. Holes. The Leshy still walks his ancient paths through the timber. The Vodyanoy still claims his due from the waters. The Rusalki still sing their mournful songs under the moon. The Domovoi still guards his hearth, and Baba Yaga still flies through the night in her mortar, her iron teeth gleaming. They are the memory of the land itself, the consciousness of nature that refuses to be forgotten, the proof that the world is not dead, matter, but living spirit. And they remind us that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the universe is populated by intelligences, both ancient and alien, and that the price of forgetting them, of treating the earth as if it were empty and silent and ours to command, is a price we may not be able to pay. The demons of Slavic folklore are not relics of the past. They are guardians of the future, keepers of the old wisdom that taught our ancestors how to live in harmony with forces greater than themselves. In their stories, in their warnings, and in their enduring presence, we find not superstition, but profound truth, that respect for the unseen, reverence for nature, and humility before the mysteries of existence are not primitive beliefs to be outgrown, but essential virtues to be reclaimed, if we are to survive the darkness that we ourselves have created.